Racist waitress refuses service to black couple, then realizes they own the restaurant. The afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of Miller's Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor tiles that had seen decades of footsteps. Diane Matthews adjusted her navy blue apron with practiced efficiency, her movements quick and precise after 7 years of working these same tables. The familiar scent of coffee and grilled onions hung in the air, mingling with the quiet murmur of conversation from the regulars who had claimed their usual spots. If you love your family, subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming moments. At 42, Diane had grown comfortable with the predictable rhythm of the diner. She knew exactly when Mr. Peterson would arrive for his afternoon coffee, black with 2 sugars, and how Mrs. Henderson preferred her toast barely touched by heat. These patterns had become her security blanket, a carefully constructed world where everything made sense. Her section of the diner was her domain, and she took pride in maintaining its delicate balance. The brass bell above the door chimed, its familiar tone cutting through the ambient chatter. Diane's head snapped up, an automatic response honed by years of service, but her usual welcoming smile froze halfway to formation. A couple had entered, not her usual clientele, not by any measure. The man wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his shoes reflecting the afternoon light with an expensive gleam. The woman beside him carried herself with an elegance that seemed almost foreign in the worn comfort of Miller's, her cream-colored blazer and pencil skirt speaking of corporate meetings rather than casual dining. But it wasn't their clothing that made Diane's spine stiffen. It was the color of their skin, dark and rich against the backdrop of her predominantly white customer base. In that moment, Diane felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the unconscious response she'd never quite acknowledged to herself. Her fingers clutched her order pad more tightly, knuckles whitening as she watched them pause in the entrance, taking in the scene before them. The couple's presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the diner. A few regular customers glanced up from their meals, their expressions ranging from curious to uncomfortable. Old Joe Barrett, nursing his eternal cup of coffee at the counter, turned completely around on his stool to stare. Diane felt a surge of protective irritation. This was her space, her sanctuary of routine and familiarity, and these outsiders were disrupting it simply by existing. Taking a deep breath, she approached them with short, clipped steps. Her usual graceful waitress glide had transformed into something more defensive, as if she were approaching potential troublemakers rather than customers. The woman smiled at her, warm and genuine, but Diane couldn't bring herself to meet those friendly brown eyes. Instead, she fixed her gaze somewhere between the woman's left ear and shoulder. "Welcome to Miller's," she said, her tone carrying none of the warmth she reserved for her regulars. The words felt like ice chips falling from her lips. "We're pretty busy right now." It wasn't true. Several booths sat empty, their surfaces recently wiped clean and waiting for occupants. The lie hung in the air, obvious and ugly. The man stepped forward slightly, his presence somehow both commanding and gentle. "We'd love a table for 2, if possible," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of higher education. Diane's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Who did they think they were, coming in here with their fancy clothes and educated voices? There might be other establishments more suited to your... Diane paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. Preferences. She gestured vaguely toward the door, suggesting the more upscale restaurant several blocks away. "The Riverside Cafe has a lovely view of the water." The woman's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. Perhaps, of a familiar dance she'd performed too many times before. "We've heard wonderful things about Miller's," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that made Diane's suggestion seem even more shallow and petty. "We'd really prefer to dine here if you don't mind." Diane felt the weight of eyes on her back. Several regulars had stopped eating to watch the exchange, their expressions unreadable. The silence stretched uncomfortably. broken only by the sizzle of burgers on the distant grill and the gentle hum of the ceiling fans. In that moment, Diane realized she had no choice. Refusing service would be too obvious, too blatant. Her prejudice preferred to hide in the shadows of subtle discourtesy rather than step into the harsh light of outright discrimination. With a tight-lipped grimace that might have been mistaken for a smile in poor lighting, Diane grabbed 2 sticky menus from the hostess station. "Like, follow me," she said, turning abruptly on her heel. She led them past the coveted window booths, beyond the comfortable central tables, weaving through the diner until she reached the section she privately referred to as Siberia. The tables tucked away near the swinging kitchen doors, where the clatter of dishes and shouts of kitchen staff created a constant disruption. "Here you are," she said, dropping the menus onto a table that wobbled slightly on its aging base. A burst of steam from the kitchen doors wafted past them, carrying the sharp scent of cleaning solution mixed with grease. The fluorescent light above them flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the worn tabletop. The couple exchanged a glance that spoke volumes, years of shared experiences compressed into a single look. The man pulled out a chair for his companion, the gesture somehow transforming the shabby corner into something more dignified. They settled into their seats with a grace that seemed to highlight the table's inadequacies rather than be diminished by them. Diane stood there for a moment, order pad in hand, her pen tapping an irregular rhythm against the paper. The couple took their time opening the menus, handling the laminated pages with the same respect they might show to fine dining establishments. Their composure only served to irritate Diane further. She had expected, perhaps even hoped for, some sign of discomfort or complaint that would justify her treatment of them. "The special today is meatloaf," she said curtly, not bothering to mention the sides or the fact that it came with freshly baked cornbread, information she usually shared with enthusiasm to her regular customers. "Soup's vegetable beef." She deliberately left out that it was homemade, a point of pride for the diner's longtime cook, Maria. The kitchen doors swung open again, releasing another blast of hot air and the sound of clattering pots. The woman smoothed her napkin across her lap, undisturbed by the chaos behind her. "Could you tell us about your coffee?" she asked pleasantly. "We've heard it's quite special." Diane's fingers tightened around her pen. The diner's coffee was indeed special. They used a local roaster who created a unique blend just for them, and she usually loved telling customers about it. But now she merely shrugged. It's just coffee," she replied flatly. "Nothing fancy." She watched with grim satisfaction as a particularly loud crash from the kitchen made the woman jump slightly. The man reached across the table, briefly touching his companion's hand. The simple gesture carried such tenderness that Diane had to look away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of it. "We'll need a few minutes," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. Those few words carried a weight that made Diane feel small, though she couldn't quite understand why. She turned away without acknowledging his request, her shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum floor as she retreated. From the corner of her eye, she could see other customers watching her, their expressions mixed. Old Joe had finally turned back to his coffee, but his shoulders were tense in a way she'd never seen before. Martha Wilson, who had been coming to the diner every Tuesday for as long as Diane could remember, was frowning into her club sandwich. Behind the counter, Diane busied herself with refilling sugar dispensers, her movements sharp and aggressive. She could see the couple's reflection in the chrome of the coffee maker. They were sitting close together, speaking in low voices, their heads inclined toward each other in a way that excluded the world around them. Despite their unwelcome presence in her domain, there was something compelling about their dignity, their quiet confidence in the face of her hostility. The man was studying the diner now, his gaze methodically taking in every detail, the vintage photos on the walls, the worn but clean floors, the outdated light fixtures. There was something purposeful about his observation that made Diane uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on why. The woman was making notes on her phone, her perfectly manicured fingers moving quickly across the screen. Diane realized she had filled the same sugar dispenser twice, granules spilling across the counter in her distraction. As she wiped up the mess, she felt her certainty wavering slightly. The couple's calm demeanor in the face of her rudeness was making her feel increasingly uncomfortable, though she tried to suppress the feeling. She had convinced herself over the years that her actions were justified, that she was protecting the comfortable atmosphere of her diner. But watching them now, she couldn't quite remember why their presence felt so threatening. Lawrence Jameson squeezed his wife's hand beneath the wobbly table, their fingers intertwining in a gesture perfected over 15 years of marriage. The kitchen doors behind them swung with metronomic precision, each burst of sound and steam marking time like a chaotic clock. He watched Danielle's profile as she studied the menu, noting the slight tightening around her eyes, a tell only he would recognize, betraying her discomfort beneath her composed exterior. "The meatloaf might be good," he murmured, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her wrist. "Though I suspect we weren't given the full sales pitch." His voice carried a hint of wry amusement rather than bitterness, a tone developed through countless similar experiences. Danielle's lips curved into a subtle smile, her shoulders relaxing slightly at his familiar humor. "I'm more interested in the coffee she's so reluctant to discuss," Danielle replied, her voice pitched low enough to remain private despite the diner's acoustics. She lifted her gaze to survey the space around them, but her observation was neither furtive nor apologetic. Instead, she took in details with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years in restaurant management, the wear patterns on the floor indicating popular seating areas, the efficiency of the servers' stations, the flow of traffic between kitchen and dining room. Lawrence recognized her analytical expression, the same one she'd worn when they'd first discussed purchasing the diner. His own attention turned to the decorative elements that most customers would overlook: the age of the framed photographs, the quality of their mounting, the craftsmanship of the crown molding that had been painted over dozens of times. As a restoration architect, he saw past the surface wear to the bones of the place, its inherent character and potential. The waitress, Diane, according to her nameplate, was making a show of avoiding their table, though her movements betrayed her hyper-awareness of their presence. She circled the dining room like a wary cat, refilling coffee cups and chatting with regular customers while shooting occasional glances in their direction. Each time she passed near their section, her spine stiffened noticeably, as if expecting confrontation. "She's been here a long time," Danielle observed quietly, noting the easy familiarity Diane showed with certain customers. "Look at how Mr. Redcap there doesn't even have to order. She just brings his refill at exactly the right moment." Her tone held no judgment, only professional interest and perhaps a touch of sympathy. They both understood how change could feel threatening to those who had carved out their territory in a familiar space. Lawrence nodded, watching as Diane laughed at something an elderly customer said, her entire demeanor transforming. For that brief moment, her face lit up with genuine warmth, showing a glimpse of the person she could be when not armored in prejudice. "Territory is a powerful thing," he replied, thinking of the numerous renovation projects he'd overseen where longtime employees struggled with even the smallest changes to their workplace. The sound of shattering ceramic cut through the ambient noise, followed by a string of muffled curses from the kitchen. Diane's head snapped up, her expression shifting from forced joviality to irritation as she glanced toward their table, as if they were somehow responsible for the disruption occurring behind the swinging doors. The incident seemed to remind her of their presence, and she finally began making her way toward them, order pad held like a shield. "Ready to order?" she asked, her clipped tone suggesting she hoped they weren't. Her pen hovered above the pad, her entire posture radiating reluctance. The contrast between this interaction and her warm exchanges with other customers was stark, but neither Lawrence nor Danielle acknowledged it. "Yes, thank you," Lawrence replied, his voice carrying the same measured politeness he used in board meetings. "I'd love to try that special meatloaf you mentioned. And about that coffee. We've actually heard wonderful things about your local roaster. Would you recommend it?" His question was genuine, offered without sarcasm or challenge, giving her an opportunity to share her knowledge if she chose to take it. Diane's pen stilled against the paper, a fleeting expression of surprise crossing her features. For a moment, she seemed caught between her habitual hostility and her genuine pride in the diner's coffee. Professional pride won out, albeit reluctantly. "It's a special blend," she admitted, the words coming out stiffly. "Dark roast with hints of chocolate and cherry. They roast it fresh every week for us." "That sounds perfect," Danielle smiled, warming to the topic. "2 cups, please. And I'll have the grilled chicken sandwich. Is it true you make your own herb mayonnaise?" She had noticed the small detail on the menu, the kind of touch that suggested care in the kitchen despite the diner's worn appearance. Again, Diane seemed thrown by their knowledge of the establishment's specialties. "Yes," she said shortly, but her grip on the pen had loosened slightly. "Made fresh every morning." She wrote their orders with quick, aggressive strokes, but her hands weren't quite as steady as before. "Wonderful," Lawrence said, handing her their menus. His fingers brushed against hers accidentally during the exchange, and she pulled back as if burned, the menus clattering onto her order pad. A few nearby customers looked up at the noise, and Lawrence noticed several of them quickly averting their eyes, their discomfort with the situation evident in their hurried movements. As Diane retreated to put in their order, Danielle leaned forward slightly. "The bones of this place are incredible," she murmured, her restaurant developer's instincts fully engaged. "Look at the original Art Deco details on those column capitals. They've been painted over at least a dozen times, but the craftsmanship is still visible." Lawrence followed her gaze, noting the architectural elements that had caught his attention during their initial assessment of the property. "The foundation is solid too," he added quietly. "All it needs is someone to see its potential." Their words carried weight beyond the physical structure, encompassing the community hub this place had been and could be again. The coffee arrived with a clatter, dark liquid sloshing dangerously close to the cup's rims as Diane set them down with more force than necessary. She didn't ask if they needed cream or sugar, already turning away when Lawrence's voice stopped her. "Excuse me," he said politely, "but could we get some cream, please?" Diane's shoulders tensed visibly, but she moved to the service station and returned with a small ceramic creamer. As she set it down, her movement was interrupted by a booming laugh from across the diner. An elderly man had just entered, greeting several regulars with obvious familiarity. Lawrence noticed how Diane's expression softened automatically at the sound, before hardening again as she remembered their presence. "Thank you," Danielle said warmly, reaching for the creamer. She poured with precise movements, the kind of grace that came from years of formal dinners and business lunches. Lawrence watched as Diane lingered for a moment, seemingly transfixed by the elegant gesture that seemed so out of place in her domain, yet somehow made their corner of the diner feel more refined. The kitchen doors swung open again, and the rich aroma of garlic and herbs wafted out, along with the sound of sizzling griddles and clattering pans. Lawrence inhaled appreciatively, recognizing the signs of a well-run kitchen despite its modest surroundings. He caught Danielle's eye, seeing his own thoughts reflected there. This place had so much potential, not just in its physical structure, but in its heart, its role in the community. Their food arrived with the same brusque efficiency Diane had displayed throughout their visit. The meatloaf was perfectly cooked, steam rising from the generous portion, and the sandwich was clearly crafted with care despite its simple presentation. They began eating in comfortable silence, years of shared meals making words unnecessary. Lawrence paused between bites to make mental notes about the space, his architect's eye cataloging elements that would need attention during the renovation. The lighting fixtures needed updating, the booth upholstery was worn, and the ventilation system clearly needed work. But beneath these surface issues, he could see what had drawn them to this place, its inherent character, its possibility for transformation. Diane continued to orbit their table like a reluctant satellite, drawn by professional obligation but resistant to any genuine interaction. Her discomfort seemed to grow with each passing moment, perhaps intensified by their continued composure in the face of her hostility. Every time she approached, her movements became more agitated, her remarks more clipped, as if their calm acceptance of her behavior was more unsettling than any confrontation would have been. As they finished their meal, Lawrence caught Diane's eye and politely requested to speak with the manager. Her reaction, a quick flash of triumph followed by defensive hostility, suggested she had been waiting for this moment, perhaps expecting a complaint that would justify her treatment of them. Her warning about the manager's likely response to complaints from strangers carried an edge of satisfaction that almost masked her underlying nervousness. What she couldn't know was that Lawrence and Danielle had already met Mark, the current manager, several times during the purchase negotiations. They had spent hours discussing the diner's history, its regular customers, and its potential for growth, but they kept their expressions neutral, accepting Diane's warning with the same quiet dignity they had maintained throughout the meal. The afternoon light had begun to soften, casting longer shadows across the diner's worn linoleum floor. The lunch rush had dwindled to a quiet murmur of conversation, punctuated by the gentle clink of coffee cups and the distant rhythm of kitchen work. Lawrence dabbed his napkin against his lips, the gesture deliberate and unhurried, while Danielle finished the last bite of her sandwich. The quality of the food had surprised them both. Beneath the surface of Diane's hostile service lay evidence of a kitchen that took pride in its work. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted imperceptibly throughout their meal. The initial shock of their presence had given way to something more complex, a subtle undercurrent of discomfort that had nothing to do with their race and everything to do with Diane's increasingly obvious behavior. Regular customers who had first averted their eyes now cast questioning glances between their plates and the unfolding scene, their disquiet growing with each of Diane's curt interactions. Martha Wilson, the Tuesday regular with perfectly styled silver hair, had stopped eating her club sandwich entirely. Her eyes followed Diane's movements with growing disapproval, her expression reminiscent of a disappointed schoolteacher. At the counter, old Joe Barrett's shoulders remained rigid, but he had begun turning slightly on his stool, his weathered face bearing an expression of increasing concern rather than his initial suspicion. Diane seemed oblivious to this shift in her audience, her actions becoming more pronounced as if feeding off her own mounting frustration. She practically threw their check onto the table, the small plastic tray skittering across the surface before Lawrence caught it with steady hands. "Pay at the register when you're ready," she snapped, already turning away when Lawrence's voice, quiet but firm, stopped her in her tracks. "Could you please let your manager know we'd like to speak with him?" The request was polite, professional, but it carried an undertone of authority that made Diane's steps falter. She turned back slowly, her face flushed with a combination of anger and what might have been fear. "Like I said before," she replied, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Mark doesn't take kindly to troublemakers. This is a family establishment, and we have standards to maintain." The irony of her words hung heavy in the air, her own behavior having done more to disturb the diner's peaceful atmosphere than anything Lawrence and Danielle had done. A few seats away, Martha Wilson's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp and disapproving. The elderly woman's lips were pressed into a thin line, her usually pleasant features marked by distress. She had been coming to Miller's Diner for over 2 decades, and while she had witnessed occasional tensions, she had never seen such blatant discourtesy from any staff member. Danielle met Diane's hostile gaze with steady calm. "We understand it's a family establishment," she said softly. "That's precisely why we'd like to speak with Mark." Her tone held no accusation, no anger, just a quiet certainty that made Diane's aggressive stance seem increasingly inappropriate. The waitress's hands twisted her order pad, creasing the pages. "I've worked here for 7 years," she declared, as if this tenure gave her special authority. "I know what's best for this place, and I know our customers. Mark trusts my judgment about these things." Her voice had risen slightly, drawing even more attention from the remaining diners. Lawrence reached for his wife's hand across the table, the gesture natural and unaffected. 7 years is a significant investment, he acknowledged, his words measured and thoughtful. You must care deeply about this establishment. The comment, genuine rather than sarcastic, seemed to throw Diane off balance. She stared at them, her defenses momentarily wavering in the face of their continued composure. The power dynamic had begun to shift, though she couldn't quite grasp how or why. Her territory, so carefully maintained through years of routine and familiar faces, felt suddenly less secure. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing a burst of warm air and the smell of fresh coffee. The afternoon cook, Miguel, poked his head out, his expression curious as he surveyed the unusual tension in the dining room. His eyes met Lawrence's briefly, and a flash of recognition crossed his features before he quickly disappeared back into the kitchen. Diane, focused on her own distress, missed this small exchange entirely. "I'll tell Mark you want to see him," she finally said, her tone suggesting she was granting them a great concession. "But don't expect any special treatment. We deal with complaints in a professional manner here." The emphasis she placed on professional carried a weight of irony that seemed lost on her alone. As Diane stalked away toward the back office, Danielle noticed several customers exchanging glances and whispered comments. The diner's regular rhythm had been disrupted, not by their presence as Diane had feared, but by her own behavior. The community she thought she was protecting was showing signs of rejecting the very prejudice she believed she shared with them. An elderly gentleman at a nearby table cleared his throat, catching Lawrence's attention. "Been coming here 30 years, he said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle drawl of a lifetime in the area. "Never seen anything like this. It's not right." His comment, though barely above a whisper, seemed to break a dam. Several other customers nodded in agreement, their earlier discomfort finding voice in soft murmurs of support. Lawrence acknowledged them with a gentle smile, but offered no commentary on Diane's behavior. Instead, he turned to Danielle, discussing potential paint colors for the walls as if they were simply any other couple enjoying a late lunch. Their conversation, purposefully casual, yet focused on the diner's aesthetic, drew curious looks from those close enough to overhear. The original wainscoting probably matches these Art Deco details, Lawrence mused, gesturing toward the ceiling. Under all those layers of paint, there's likely some beautiful woodwork. His voice carried just far enough to reach nearby tables, planting seeds of curiosity about changes to come. Danielle nodded, making notes on her phone. "The natural light in here is gorgeous," she observed. "Once we update the window treatments, it'll transform the whole space." She spoke with the quiet confidence of someone discussing their own property, though none of the other customers could know that yet. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Diane had returned, her face flushed and her movements agitated. "Mark will be out in a minute," she announced, her tone suggesting she expected this meeting to vindicate her actions. "He's just finishing up some paperwork." The minutes that followed were charged with anticipation. Diane hovered near the counter, straightening items that didn't need straightening, her movements becoming increasingly jerky as time passed. The remaining customers seemed reluctant to leave, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Old Joe Barrett had given up any pretense of not watching, turning fully around on his stool to face the dining room. Martha Wilson had pulled out her phone but wasn't looking at it, her attention fixed on the subtle drama playing out before her. Even Miguel made another appearance from the kitchen, ostensibly to check on coffee levels but clearly interested in what was about to happen. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed entirely from when Lawrence and Danielle had first entered. The initial current of discomfort had shifted direction, now flowing toward Diane rather than away from the couple she had tried so hard to alienate. Her authority over this space, once seemingly absolute, had begun to crumble under the weight of her own actions. Lawrence and Danielle remained seated, their posture relaxed but dignified. They continued their quiet discussion about the diner's potential. each word carefully chosen to be overheard without being obvious. Their calm in the face of Diane's hostility had gradually revealed the ugliness of her prejudice, not through confrontation, but through simple presence and patience. The sound of a door opening at the back of the diner drew everyone's attention. Mark's familiar figure appeared, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile as he caught sight of Lawrence and Danielle. The moment of revelation was approaching, and with it, a fundamental shift in the power dynamics that Diane had taken for granted for so long. Mark's footsteps echoed across the suddenly quiet diner as he made his way toward Lawrence and Danielle's table. His familiar figure, clad in the same well-worn plaid shirt he'd worn for countless shifts, moved with purpose through the space. But it was his expression that caught everyone's attention, not the stern, defensive look Diane had promised, but a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Jameson," he called out warmly, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed dining room. "I was wondering when you'd drop by for an unofficial visit." He extended his hand to Lawrence, who stood to greet him with the easy familiarity of previous acquaintance. The sound of shattering porcelain cut through the air as Diane's cleaning rag slipped, taking a coffee cup with it. She stood frozen behind the counter, her face draining of color as she watched Mark embrace Danielle like an old friend. The pieces of the broken cup lay forgotten at her feet, a physical representation of her fragmenting reality. "Mark," Lawrence smiled, gesturing for the manager to join them. "We couldn't resist getting a feel for the lunch service. The meatloaf was exceptional. Miguel's recipe, I assume." The casual mention of the cook's name, the easy knowledge of kitchen staff details, struck Diane like physical blows. Her hands gripped the counter's edge, knuckles white with tension. Other customers had abandoned any pretense of disinterest, openly watching the scene unfold. Martha Wilson's mouth formed a perfect O of surprise, while old Joe Barrett leaned so far forward on his stool he was in danger of sliding off. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the tableau like a spotlight on a stage. "Actually," Mark chuckled, pulling up a chair, "that's Maria's secret recipe. She's been guarding it for 20 years now." He settled comfortably at their table, his posture relaxed and familiar. "Though I suppose she'll have to share it with you now, being the new owners and all." The word owners fell into the silence like a stone into still water, ripples of reaction spreading through the diner. A quiet gasp escaped from somewhere near the counter. Diane's cleaning rag slipped from her nerveless fingers, landing silently on the broken cup shards at her feet. "Owners?" The word escaped her lips as barely more than a whisper, but in the hushed diner, it carried to every corner. The couple she had treated with such disdain, whom she had tried to drive away from her diner, whom she had seated in the worst possible location, they owned the entire establishment. Lawrence turned slightly in his chair, his eyes meeting Diane's across the space. His expression held no triumph, no vindictiveness, just a calm acknowledgement of the truth. "Yes," he said quietly. "Danielle and I finalized the purchase last week. We've been making subtle observations, getting a feel for the place before meeting with the staff officially." Danielle reached into her designer bag, retrieving a sleek leather portfolio that suddenly seemed glaringly out of place in the modest diner. "We've been in the restaurant business for 15 years, she explained, her voice carrying the same warmth it had held even in the face of Diane's hostility. "When we heard Miller's was up for sale, we knew it was a perfect opportunity. This place has such wonderful potential." Mark nodded enthusiastically, seemingly oblivious to the mounting tension. "I've been showing them around after hours, introducing them to the night shift staff. They've got some fantastic ideas for updates, but they're committed to keeping the heart of the place intact." His casual words confirmed what Diane had been desperately hoping was some sort of mistake or misunderstanding. The diner's regular customers, who had witnessed every moment of Diane's earlier behavior, now sat in uncomfortable silence. The implications of her actions hung heavy in the air. Each remembered slight and snide comment, taking on new weight in light of this revelation. Martha Wilson's disapproving expression had softened to something approaching pity, while old Joe Barrett studied his coffee cup with unprecedented intensity. Miguel appeared in the kitchen doorway again, this time with a knowing smile. "Ya les dijiste," he called out to Mark, his previously formal demeanor replaced with familiar ease. The simple question confirmed what Diane was beginning to realize. She was the last to know, the only one who had been kept in the dark about this change in ownership. "We wanted to experience the diner as regular customers first," Lawrence explained, his voice carrying across the silent space. "To understand how it feels to walk in here for the first time, to see how the staff interacts with newcomers." The pointed observation was delivered without accusation, but its impact was unmistakable. Diane's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The territory she had so jealously guarded, the authority she had wielded like a weapon, suddenly evaporated. Her legs felt unsteady, and she gripped the counter harder, afraid she might actually collapse. 7 years of building her position, of establishing her dominance over this space, had just been rendered meaningless in the span of a few seconds. I didn't," she stammered, her voice barely audible. The words stuck in her throat. Years of justifications and explanations crumbling in the face of this new reality. The couple she had tried to drive away now held complete authority over her employment, her livelihood, her daily routine. Danielle opened her portfolio, revealing neat stacks of papers, blueprints, renovation plans, staff schedules. "We're planning to hold a full staff meeting next week," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "We want to discuss our vision for the diner's future with everyone." She paused, her eyes finding Diane's across the room. "We hope you'll join us, Diane. Your experience here is valuable." The offer of inclusion, so at odds with her own exclusionary behavior, struck Diane like a physical blow. She had expected immediate dismissal, angry confrontation, public humiliation. Instead, she was being offered a chance to be part of something new, despite her actions, or perhaps because of them, as an object lesson in the changes to come. Mark began discussing some of the planned improvements, his enthusiasm evident in his animated gestures. "The Jamesons want to restore some of the original architectural features," he explained to the openly eavesdropping customers. "Bring back the Art Deco elements that made this place so special when it first opened." Lawrence nodded, warming to the subject. "The bones of this building are extraordinary," he said, his architect's passion evident in his voice. "We want to honor its history while making it more welcoming to everyone in the community." The emphasis on everyone was subtle but clear, a gentle repudiation of the exclusionary atmosphere Diane had helped cultivate. The afternoon sun had shifted again, its rays now highlighting the worn areas Diane had stopped seeing years ago, the scuffed floors, the faded upholstery, the water stains on the ceiling. But now these imperfections seemed less like comfortable familiarity and more like evidence of needed change. Her diner, her territory, had already begun its transformation without her even realizing it. The revelation continued to ripple through the space, changing not just the power dynamic, but the very atmosphere of the diner. What had felt like her personal domain just hours ago now seemed like a stage set about to be struck, with her role as principal player suddenly revised to that of a cautionary example. The weight of her earlier behavior pressed down on her shoulders, each remembered slight and sneer magnified by the knowledge of who she had been attempting to drive away. The rest of Diane's shift passed in a blur of mechanical movements and avoided gazes. Her hands shook slightly as she poured coffee, causing dark droplets to splash onto saucers. Twice she input wrong orders into the system, mistakes she hadn't made in years. The familiar rhythm of the diner, once her comfort zone, now felt like a minefield of potential humiliations. Every surface seemed to reflect her shame back at her. The gleaming coffee urns showed her pinched expression, the freshly wiped tables mirrored her uncertain movements. Even the sound of her shoes on the linoleum floor seemed different. No longer the confident stride of authority, but the hesitant steps of someone who had lost their way. The news of ownership spread through the diner like wildfire, carried in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Regular customers who had witnessed her treatment of the Jamesons now regarded her with a mixture of disappointment and secondhand embarrassment. Martha Wilson, usually chatty during her Tuesday visits, left without their usual exchange of neighborhood gossip, her silence more condemning than any words could have been. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting long shadows across the checkered floor, Diane found herself obsessively replaying every interaction with the Jamesons. Each dismissive gesture, each cold word, each subtle slight now felt like evidence building against her. The way she had seated them by the kitchen doors, a power play that now seemed pathetically transparent. Her curt responses to their polite questions about the coffee, a petty attempt to withhold information that they, as owners, already possessed. Miguel appeared from the kitchen during a lull, his usual friendly demeanor somewhat reserved. "They're good people, Diane," he said quietly, placing a fresh pot of coffee on the warmer. "They spent 2 hours in the kitchen last week, learning about our processes, asking about our needs." The revelation that even the kitchen staff had known before her added another layer to her humiliation. The memory of Lawrence's careful observation of the diner's architecture now made perfect sense. He hadn't been looking for fault, but assessing his own property with an architect's eye. Danielle's questions about the service flow and menu specialties hadn't been those of a nosy outsider, but of an experienced restaurant owner gathering information about her new acquisition. During her break, Diane retreated to the employee bathroom, gripping the edges of the worn porcelain sink as she stared at her reflection. The face that looked back at her seemed somehow different, older, smaller, less certain. She had built her identity around being the guardian of this space, the arbiter of who belonged and who didn't. Now that foundation had crumbled, leaving her uncertain of her place in the very establishment she had considered her domain. The sound of laughter filtered through the thin walls, Mark showing another group of customers the preliminary renovation plans. His voice carried clearly. "The Jamesons want to preserve the community feeling while making it more inclusive." The word inclusive seemed to hang in the air, a direct challenge to everything Diane had represented in her years of service. She thought about quitting, about walking out before she could be fired. It would be easier than facing the daily reminder of her prejudice, easier than watching the transformation of her carefully maintained territory under new ownership. But the prospect of leaving filled her with a different kind of dread. The diner had been her anchor for 7 years, the place where she felt in control, where she mattered. The idea of starting over somewhere else, of building a new routine, seemed overwhelming. Back in the dining room, she watched as a young interracial couple entered the diner, clearly drawn by the buzz about new ownership. In the past, she would have given them the same treatment she had attempted with the Jamesons: subtle discouragements, cold service, seating designed to make them uncomfortable. Now she stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. Her ingrained responses felt dangerous, like a trap waiting to spring. Mark approached the couple before she could move, his welcome warm and genuine. She watched as he seated them at one of the prime window booths, her window booths, as she had thought of them for so long. The couple's ease in the space, their obvious comfort, stirred something uncomfortable in her chest. How many potential regular customers had she driven away over the years? How many connections had been severed before they could form? The afternoon wore on, and word of the ownership change continued to spread. Some of her regular customers, the ones she had considered allies in maintaining the diner's traditional atmosphere, now looked at her differently. Old Joe Barrett, who had always supported her subtle exclusions with knowing looks and nods, couldn't meet her eyes. The comfortable conspiracy of prejudice she had cultivated was dissolving in the harsh light of accountability. She found herself hypersensitive to every interaction, second-guessing each word and gesture. When a group of college students came in, diverse, laughing, taking up space, she had to consciously check her usual impulse to discourage them. Instead, she took their order mechanically, neither warm nor cold, retreating into a neutrality that felt foreign to her nature. The Jamesons' words about the staff meeting next week echoed in her thoughts. Their offer of inclusion seemed impossible to reconcile with her behavior. How could she sit in that meeting, facing co-workers who had witnessed her prejudice? How could she contribute to discussions about making the diner more welcoming when she had spent years doing the opposite? As her shift neared its end, Diane noticed small details she had overlooked before. The way Miguel's shoulders tensed slightly when she entered the kitchen, the careful distance other servers maintained, the subtle ways the staff had adapted to work around her biases rather than challenge them. She wondered how long they had been doing this dance, pretending not to notice her prejudice while quietly disapproving. The renovation plans lay forgotten on a corner table, and she found herself drawn to them during a quiet moment. The blueprints showed a vision of the diner that was both familiar and radically different. The same bones, but with renewed vitality. The same heart, but with a broader embrace. It would be beautiful. She realized with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Beautiful, and perhaps no longer hers. The sun was setting as she prepared for the evening shift change, casting long shadows across the diner's worn surfaces. Tomorrow loomed like a sentence, another day of facing her colleagues, knowing looks, of navigating a space where her authority had been not just undermined but revealed as illegitimate. The comfortable patterns of her life had been disrupted, leaving her adrift in territory that was both achingly familiar and suddenly foreign. As she hung up her apron, her fingers traced the embroidered name tag she had worn with such pride. 7 years of service, she had told the Jamesons, as if longevity justified prejudice. Now those years felt less like an achievement and more like a testament to how long she had maintained her comfortable illusions. How deeply she had entrenched herself in patterns that could no longer continue. The weight of accountability pressed down on her shoulders as she gathered her belongings. She had built her identity around being the guardian of this space, but that role had been revealed as something far less noble than she had imagined. The challenge ahead was not just about keeping her job. It was about confronting the person she had become and deciding who she wanted to be in this new chapter of the diner story. The week following the revelation crawled by with excruciating slowness. Each shift felt like walking through quicksand. Every interaction weighted with the memory of her exposed prejudice. Diane found herself arriving earlier for her shifts, slipping in through the back entrance like a ghost, trying to minimize her visibility even as she continued her duties. The morning regulars, her former confederates in maintaining what she had thought of as the diner's proper atmosphere, now seemed like mirrors reflecting her own discomfort. Some, like Harold Peterson with his daily scrambled eggs and wheat toast, attempted to maintain their usual banter, but their conversations felt hollow, haunted by the unspoken acknowledgement of shared prejudices that could no longer hide in plain sight. On Wednesday morning, she overheard 2 longtime customers discussing the upcoming changes. "About time this place got an update," the woman said, stirring her coffee. "My daughter stopped coming here years ago after the way she and her girlfriend were treated." The words struck Diane like a physical blow, another revelation of the impact her actions had had on the community she claimed to protect. The diner itself seemed to mock her with memories. Every corner held the ghost of some past slight. The booth where she had deliberately ignored a Hispanic family until they left. The counter where she had made a group of black teenagers feel unwelcome with pointed glares and curt service. The table where she had seated an elderly Asian couple far from their friends, claiming it was the only space available despite several empty booths. Miguel, who had worked the kitchen for longer than Diane had been a server, began leaving plates on the pass-through without their usual friendly exchange. Not with hostility, but with a quiet disappointment that felt worse than anger. Once, she caught him showing a new prep cook the proper way to plate the meatloaf, adding the extra touch of fresh parsley that he had always reserved for special customers. A distinction she now realized had been his subtle rebellion against her prejudices. The younger servers, who had always deferred to her authority, now moved through their sections with a new independence. They seated customers where they chose, regardless of Diane's unspoken rules about who belonged where. Sarah, barely 20 and usually timid, deliberately seated a mixed-race family at the prime window booth, meeting Diane's instinctive glare with a steady gaze that forced her to look away first. Each shift brought new challenges to her ingrained behaviors. When a group of college students, Black, Asian, white, and Hispanic all together, came in laughing and talking, her first impulse was to tell them they were too loud, to suggest they might be more comfortable elsewhere. Instead, she watched as Mark welcomed them warmly, pulling tables together to accommodate their group, their joy filling the space she had tried so hard to keep controlled and subdued. The physical changes to the diner had already begun, subtle at first but increasingly noticeable. Lawrence supervised as workers carefully stripped away layers of paint from a section of wainscoting, revealing the original rich woodwork beneath. The process seemed like a metaphor for what was happening to the diner's social atmosphere, years of accumulated prejudice being stripped away to reveal something more authentic and beautiful underneath. By Friday, news of the ownership change had spread throughout the community. The diner saw an influx of new faces, people who had clearly avoided the place before, whether due to word of mouth or personal experience. Each new customer felt like an indictment of the exclusive atmosphere Diane had helped cultivate. She watched as they entered tentatively, clearly expecting resistance, only to be greeted with the warm welcome that should have been standard all along. Martha Wilson, who had maintained her silence toward Diane all week, finally spoke up during a quiet moment. "You know," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I always wondered why my granddaughter wouldn't join me for lunch here. Now I understand." The simple statement carried the weight of years of complicity, both Martha's and Diane's, in maintaining an atmosphere of exclusion. The upcoming staff meeting loomed larger in Diane's mind with each passing day. The Jamesons had been present throughout the week, overseeing initial renovation work and meeting with suppliers, but they had maintained a professional distance from her. Their courtesy was unfailing, their interactions properly businesslike, but their very presence served as a constant reminder of her behavior during their first visit. Late one afternoon, as Diane was refilling sugar dispensers, she overheard Danielle discussing plans for a community board near the entrance. "We want to showcase local events, celebrations, all the different aspects of our neighborhood," she explained to Mark. "Make it clear that this is a space for everyone." The idea of actively inviting diversity into the space Diane had tried so hard to keep exclusive made her hands shake, sugar granules spilling across the counter. The weekend brought more changes. Lawrence supervised as workers carefully removed the dusty plastic plants that had decorated the windows for decades. In their place, he began installing simple but elegant wooden planters. "We're partnering with the high school's horticultural program," he explained to anyone who asked. "The students will maintain the plants as part of their community service projects." Another boundary being erased, another connection being forged with parts of the community Diane had helped keep at arm's length. On Sunday, Diane arrived to find Danielle training the staff on new service protocols. "Everyone deserves the same high level of hospitality," she emphasized, her eyes meeting each server's in turn. When her gaze reached Diane, there was no accusation there, only a clear expectation of professionalism. The message was unmistakable. The old ways of selective service were over. The morning before the staff meeting, Diane stood in front of her bathroom mirror, practicing what she might say. Every attempted explanation felt hollow. Every justification collapsed under the weight of scrutiny. How could she explain behaviors she could no longer justify even to herself? The face in the mirror looked older, more uncertain, but also somehow clearer, as if layers of pretense were being stripped away along with the diner's old paint. She arrived at the diner early, watching through the window as other staff members arrived. Miguel and the kitchen crew entered as a group, their easy camaraderie evident in their relaxed postures and shared laughter. The younger servers followed, Sarah leading them with newfound confidence. Mark appeared with fresh coffee and pastries, setting them up in the newly cleared back room where the meeting would be held. The Jamesons arrived last, carrying portfolios filled with their plans for the diner's future. Diane watched them greet each staff member warmly, their genuine interest in everyone's input obvious in their body language and attentive expressions. The contrast between their inclusive leadership style and her years of maintaining hierarchies and divisions was stark and uncomfortable. As she finally forced herself to enter the back room, Diane felt the weight of every exclusion, every slight, every moment of prejudice she had justified as maintaining standards. The next few hours would determine not just her professional future, but her place in a community she had helped fragment rather than unite. The time for hiding behind routines and rationalization was over. Accountability waited on the other side of that door. The back room of Miller's Diner had never felt so small. Diane sat in the last row of chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching as her co-workers filled the space with morning chatter and the rustle of paper cups. The steam from her untouched coffee curled into the air, carrying the rich aroma of the local roast she had so proudly withheld from the Jamesons just days ago. Lawrence stood at the front of the room, his architect's precision evident in the neat row of blueprints pinned to the wall behind him. Danielle moved through the gathered staff, offering pastries and warm greetings, her natural hospitality drawing people into comfortable conversation. The contrast between their leadership style and Diane's years of rigid authority felt like a physical presence in the room. "Thank you all for coming," Lawrence began, his voice carrying the same measured warmth it had maintained even through Diane's hostility. "Before we discuss the renovations and new policies, we want to emphasize something crucial. This diner's greatest asset isn't its architecture or its location. It's the community it has the potential to nurture." The word potential hung in the air, a gentle but clear acknowledgement that the diner had fallen short of this goal. Diane felt the weight of that failure personally, remembering every instance she had actively worked against such community building. Her throat tightened as memories surfaced. The young Muslim family she had rushed through their meal, the gay couple she had seated far from other diners, the countless small cruelties she had justified as maintaining standards. Danielle took over, outlining their vision for the diner's future. "We're not just updating the decor," she explained, gesturing to the blueprints. "We're revising our entire approach to service. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to feel welcomed, valued, and respected." Her eyes moved across the room, including everyone in her vision, even Diane. The meeting progressed through practical matters, new training protocols, updated menu items, renovation schedules. But underlying every discussion was a clear message about inclusion and community. The Jamesons introduced plans for monthly community dinners, cultural celebration events, and partnerships with local organizations. Each initiative felt like another brick being removed from the walls Diane had helped build around the diner. Miguel presented ideas for expanding the menu to include dishes from various cultural traditions, his enthusiasm obvious as he described fusion concepts that would honor both the diner's history and its diverse customer base. The other staff members leaned forward, engaged and excited, while Diane struggled to reconcile this vibrant vision with the controlled, exclusive environment she had worked so hard to maintain. As the meeting continued, Diane found herself shrinking further into her chair, the weight of her past actions pressing down on her shoulders. Every positive suggestion seemed to highlight another aspect of her prejudice. When Sarah enthusiastically proposed a bulletin board for local events and community announcements, Diane remembered how she had torn down flyers for the nearby Black Church's food drive, claiming they cluttered the space. The turning point came during the open discussion period. Mark shared a story about his own journey from prejudice to understanding, speaking about how his granddaughter's coming out had challenged his preconceptions about what made a normal family. His vulnerability created a space for others to share their experiences, both as witnesses to discrimination and as its targets. In that moment of shared reflection, Diane felt something crack inside her. The carefully constructed justifications for her behavior began to crumble, leaving her face to face with the raw truth of what she had done. Her hands trembled as she slowly raised them, drawing surprised looks from her colleagues. Her voice faltered, decades of ingrained defensiveness warring with the need to speak truth. I need to say something. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Lawrence and Danielle nodded encouragingly, their expressions open and attentive. I've worked here for 7 years, she began, the familiar declaration now carrying a different weight. And for 7 years, I've been wrong. I convinced myself I was protecting this place, maintaining standards, preserving tradition. But all I was really doing was hurting people and damaging our community. The words came harder now, each admission feeling like pulling thorns from deep wounds. When you came in, she looked directly at the Jamesons for the first time since the meeting began. I treated you horribly, not because of anything you did, but because of my own prejudices. I seated you by the kitchen, gave you poor service, tried to make you feel unwelcome in what I thought was my space. Tears threatened, but Diane forced herself to continue. The worst part is, you weren't the first. For years, I've been doing the same thing to anyone I decided didn't belong here. I've driven away customers, created an atmosphere of exclusion, and hurt people who just wanted to enjoy a meal in their own community. The silence in the room was profound. Some staff members looked away, uncomfortable with her raw honesty. Others, like Miguel, met her gaze with cautious hope. The Jamesons remained quietly attentive, allowing her the space to continue. I don't expect forgiveness, Diane said, her voice steadier now. And I know I haven't earned back trust, but I want to be part of making this place what it should have been all along, a true community diner where everyone is welcome. If you'll let me, I want to learn and do better. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility. Then Danielle stepped forward, her movement breaking the tension. Thank you, Diane, she said softly. Acknowledging our biases is the first step toward changing them. We're not looking to shame anyone for past actions. We're looking to build a better future together. Lawrence joined his wife, his expression thoughtful. The diner's renovation isn't just about the building, he added. It's about renovating our approach to community, our understanding of service, our definition of belonging. We'd like you to be part of that transformation, Diane, if you're willing to do the work. Over the next few hours, as the meeting shifted into practical planning sessions, Diane found herself slowly engaging with ideas she would have dismissed days ago. She listened as Sarah suggested creating welcome cards in multiple languages, offered her experience with kitchen timing when Miguel discussed expanding the menu, and even found herself volunteering to help with the community dinner program. The sun was high when the meeting finally ended, streaming through the windows and illuminating the exposed wood of the original wainscoting, beautiful despite years of being hidden under paint. As staff members gathered their things, chatting excitedly about the changes to come, Diane remained seated, absorbing the magnitude of the morning's transformation. Miguel paused by her chair, offering a small smile. Change is hard, he said quietly, but necessary. Like cleaning a wound. It hurts, but it's the only way to heal. He extended his hand, not in forgiveness exactly, but in acknowledgement of the possibility of something new. As Diane walked home that afternoon, the weight of accountability still pressed on her shoulders. But it felt different now. Less like a burden and more like the necessary foundation for growth. The diner would change, and so would she. The journey wouldn't be easy, and trust would have to be rebuilt one interaction at a time. But for the first time in years, she felt the stirring of something that felt like hope. The next morning, when she pinned her name tag to her fresh apron, Diane looked at her reflection in the chrome of the coffee maker. The face that looked back was neither the defensive guardian of exclusivity she had been, nor the fully transformed person she hoped to become. Instead, she saw someone in progress, someone learning to replace prejudice with understanding, fear with openness, and exclusion with welcome. It was a beginning, and for now, that was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.